This conference will now be recorded.
So this presentation is the second in our big kickoff week. I hope many of you were able to join us this morning for the kickoff call with Erica Ferguson and Denise Newneighbor. Today we're going to have 90 minutes to have the ESG office present to us about eligible expenses documentation. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Chris and Lisa.
Good morning, or no, good afternoon. This is Lisa. I'm going to take the first part of this talking about eligible expenses, and then Chris is going to go into the documentation piece. As you can see, we were originally going to talk about requisitions also in this presentation, but that's still a bit of a work in progress. So we're going to delay that piece of the presentation until a later date. Just one kind of caveat before we start as well. This is obviously a back at home presentation, but given that Chris and I are from the ESG office, what you're going to hear is a lot of ESG information. And so that's kind of our perspective and our piece in back at home. As you know, back at home is funded with ESG CV dollars. That's a little different than, you know, the original back at home when it was used for Hurricane Florence and Dorian. There have been, you know, some modifications and a little bit of changes for eligible expenses and eligible clients. So that's going to be kind of our focus for this presentation. So while you'll hear us say ESG or ESG CV a lot, it's all about back at home because that's where the funding is coming from for back at home. So you'll just hear our perspective from the ESG office on the expenses and documentation and what HUD requires for ESG CV. Next slide. So we'll start with the eligible expenses piece. Next slide. This is tinier than it was in my head. So I'll kind of read through that for you. So obviously back at home funds two pieces of the ESG eligible expenses or eligible activities. So the first is rapid rehousing and the second is homelessness prevention. So, and then there's two pieces or two eligible activities under each of those. One being the financial assistance piece and the other being the services piece. The financial assistance is generally the things that you probably primarily think about with rapid rehousing or prevention. You know, rental application fee, security deposit, last month's rent, utility deposits and payments, ongoing rental payments, moving costs, things like that. So it's the actual, you know, financial expenses to get somebody into housing. And then the services piece is kind of what we think of as it relates to staff time. So, you know, the time that staff put into searching for the housing or, you know, assisting with the housing search, placing people in the housing, providing that ongoing case management. And then there's a few other additional services that can be provided outside of those, you know, kind of typical ones that we think of with the search and placement and case management. So if mediation services are needed for someone to keep their housing, or legal services are needed for somebody to obtain or maintain their housing, or credit repair. So it's not necessarily paying off any credit debts or paying off any legal debts or that sort of thing. It's the actual services or staff time to provide those services or help with those things that may be standing in the way of someone being able to obtain or maintain their housing. Next slide. So the primary differences for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention come in client eligibility. The expenses that are eligible for either program, rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention, are essentially the same. So the difference comes in who is eligible for which program. For rapid rehousing, it's very simple, very basic. You have to be either literally homeless, meaning you are sleeping unsheltered, you are in a shelter, you're in an abandoned building, you know, things like that. So you are literally homeless. or you are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. That's it. That's the basic eligibility for rapid rehousing. There's no income requirements at entry for rapid rehousing. It is strictly on your homelessness status or your domestic violence status. So that's the only eligibility for rapid rehousing to get into the program. So obviously it is even more crucial these days to get people into housing. That's why the state has decided to focus on rapid rehousing as a primary component of the ESG-CV funding. It's always been important to get people off the street to help them achieve housing stability, but now more than ever it's a public health issue, and people have higher up have finally discovered that amidst this pandemic. So now's our chance with this increased funding to be able to help some more people achieve that housing stability. As I mentioned, income is not an eligibility requirement at entry. However, if they are, if a client is still in your program at the 12-month mark, then you do have to look at income as an eligibility requirement. And at that point, they have to be at or below 30% AMI, and they have to kind of show that they don't have any other resources or support networks that would help them maintain housing. And so, but for a famous expression, this assistance, they would end up homeless again. For homelessness prevention, the categories get a little trickier. You still have the fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, but this is not literally homeless. These are people that are at imminent risk of homelessness. And so typically we look at that being 14 to 21 days from being homeless, literally out on the streets. You see there category 3, other federal statutes. We're not going to get into the details of those right now, because for the most part, what we see are category 2 and category 4. If a situation comes up that somebody fits into category 3 and you have questions, then we can certainly discuss it at that point. But typically what we see is people who have an eviction notice in their hand and they are about to be out on the streets. Now, just because somebody has an eviction notice doesn't mean they'll necessarily end up homeless. They may have other resources. There may be other things that they can do other than receiving ESG assistance. But if they have no other resources and they are about to be out on the streets without this assistance, then they may be eligible for homelessness prevention funds. As I said, income is required at entry. So typically for ESG, you have to be at or below 30% AMI. And that is still where Back at Home is going to focus, is that at or below 30% AMI distinction. And so while HUD and with ESG CV has increased that to 50% AMI. So technically people are eligible if they're at 50% AMI or below. Back at Home is still focusing on that 30% AMI or lower population. So the other thing that we want to do and where the services piece comes in for this is help people get connected to those mainstream resources. And so that's part of the purpose of this program, is to help people find that stability, get back on their feet, and get connected to the resources that they need to maintain that once the ESG assistance goes away. Because as we know, it doesn't last forever. So we want, with that services piece, to get them connected to the resources that they need in the community. All right, next slide. So I think some of this goes over, part of what we went over in that last slide, but just to reiterate, rapid rehousing is category 1 and category 4, so literally homeless or fleeing domestic violence. You don't have to look at income until the 12-month mark, and at that point, you're looking at 30% AMI. Next slide. Homeless prevention. So your categories 2, 3, and 4. So generally imminent risk of homelessness or fleeing domestic violence. There are some other caveats. At 30% of area median income, A note about the reassessment. So typically ESG requires reassessment every 3 months. However, for ESG CV, HUD has extended that to every 6 months. So they're trying to be accommodating for, the case management services and not being able to see people in person and things like that, like you normally are. So they have extended that to you only have to do reassessments every 6 months. Next slide. So here's the meat of what is eligible under the financial assistance piece. So rental application fees, security deposits, utility deposits, last month's rent, ongoing utility payments, moving costs, and then the actual rental assistance itself. So the ongoing month-to-month rental assistance, also ongoing month-to-month utility payments. You can assist someone for 24 months within a 3-year period. So that's the maximum eligibility is up to 24 months. Certainly not everyone needs that much assistance, and we hope that we are able to get them stabilized before that point. And we don't go into it offering any set amount of months. When somebody comes in your door, not advisable to say, hey, we're going to pay 6 months of your rent, or we're going to pay 3 months of your rent, or 12 months of your rent. Every individual, every client is different, and so we want to meet them where they're at and assist as much as they need, but as little as they need. So we want to take just a client-centered approach to providing that assistance. And then I think there was a question in the chat, I kind of missed it, about rental arrears, but you can pay rental arrears up to 6 months of rental arrears, including late fees, if that's preventing someone from being able to get into a unit. You can also pay utility arrears up to 6 months. So there's no maximum amount that you can pay in those arrears, either rental or utility, but there is a maximum number of months. So you have to be able to, the client has to be able to provide documentation to show, how many months you're paying of those arrears, so that it doesn't go above that 6-month mark. But there's no actual dollar amount for a limit on those arrears that you can pay. If somebody is going into a subsidized unit, you cannot pay the ongoing rent because they're already receiving that type of assistance. You can't duplicate that with, you can't pay their portion of the ongoing rent with ESG funds. However, you can pay the security deposits and the utility deposits and things like that because that's not covered in those subsidized units. So you can help them get into that unit, but you cannot pay the ongoing rent or utilities for that unit. You could still pay the moving costs and things like that, that the subsidized unit or assistance doesn't cover. Yes, you can pay arrears on subsidized units. You can do a one-time payment of rental arrears for subsidized units. So I'm not sure why there's a distinction, because then you are paying their portion of the rent, but you can do that if it is arrears. You just can't pay it ongoing. One caveat I want to mention as far as back at home eligible expenses specifically. I know when back at home was funded through state dollars for Lawrence and Dorian, there were some additional things that those funds could pay for. They paid for food and move-in kits and furniture and things like that. Unfortunately, with the ESG dollars, those are not eligible expenses. So if there's an additional source of funding that we come up with to pair with the ESG dollars, then we may be able to cover those items through that funding, but those items cannot be paid for through ESG dollars. Next slide. So we've covered kind of eligible expenses. So this talks some more about what what you have to do to make a unit eligible. So the unit that that someone is moving into. Typically, you have to look at fair market rent and rent reasonableness. For ESG-CV, HUD has waived the fair market rent requirement. So you do still have to meet rent reasonableness, but you don't have to meet the fair market rent limit. Yes, so you are allowed to use the HUD waivers for units above FMR. Just a kind of caution about that. Just make sure that that's a good situation for the client that's moving into that unit. Make sure it's still something that they're going to be able to afford and maintain once ESG assistance is no longer available. Whenever that waiver expires, if they're still in that unit and they still need assistance, then ESG would no longer be able to assist because the waiver has expired, and therefore the ESG funds couldn't be used for a unit above fair market rent. Or if they've exhausted their ESG assistance, or whatever the case may be, just make sure that if you do use that waiver and put somebody in a unit that's above fair market rent, just make sure it's a good situation for that person. Rental assistance agreements, so you have to have those in place between the subrecipient, which is your agency. So your agency has to have an agreement with the landlord or the owner of the unit. This is not the lease. This is the agreement between your agency and the landlord for the assistance that you're going to provide. There also has to be a lease, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. So there's a lease between the client and the landlord, and then there's a rental assistance agreement between the agency and the landlord. So you'll see some of this when Chris goes over the documentation in a minute. There are specific ESG forms to complete for that rental assistance agreement. The unit does have to meet lead-based paint and minimum habitability standards. We know for back at home, there's going to be a contract in place for an agency to do HQS inspections, and that's excellent. HQS inspections work too, and contracting with somebody to do that takes some of the work off the staff at your agencies, and those are turned around within 24 to 48 hours typically. So it's a great advantage to be able to have that HQS inspection, and definitely something that meets HUD ESG guidelines. I believe I mentioned the maximum assistance not to exceed 24 months during any 3-year period. So that's the limit on assistance that anybody can receive through rapid rehousing or prevention. Please, as a subrecipient, make your payments on time. Good for landlord relationships, and it meets ESG guidelines. So ESG funds can't be used to pay late payments for the subrecipient. So if the client's rent is late, or we're paying arrears or something, late payments are included in that. We can include the late fees, but we can't pay the late fees if a subrecipient is late on paying their portion of the rent. So I think that's it for the eligible expenses piece, and we'll move into documentation. Please keep the questions coming in the chat. I'll be happy to answer them as Chris talks and goes through the documentation piece.
Yeah, I wonder, since we're doing well on time, Lisa, if there were 2 questions I saw that came through chat
Sure.
that we haven't answered yet that relate to eligible expenses rather than documentation. So one person asked, does that mean clients should not be exited from rapid rehousing programs until after the 24-month period in the event that they may need, sorry, my screen just went, that they may need assistance during that time frame?
So that's not something we recommend. If they are, if the client is stable and able to, afford their rent at month 6, for example, we don't recommend you keeping them open just in case. If they're at a point where they're meeting their own needs and they're good, then they should be discharged at that point. If they do need assistance in the future, hopefully there's some prevention or emergency assistance out there that will be able to assist them. But no, we don't typically recommend keeping someone open just in case they might need us 6 months down the road.
And Lisa, to add to that, that would be considered progressive engagement, and in trainings coming up forward for back at home, part of their program standards will identify some of the sort of best practices and ways to utilize rapid rehousing and prevention funding. And progressive engagement is pretty much what Lisa just explained, where you want to work with the client on a case-by-case basis, not pending future maybe lack of ability to sustain, but where they are at the time. And if with the case manager, you guys feel that that person is able to sustain on their own, you would then exit them from the program. But back at home, training should address some of those in more detail moving forward.
Thank you for those excellent answers, y'all, and for the plug for future training. That was great.
Chris is good at marketing. He tells me I should be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we do one more now? Then we'll go on to Chris's piece, and then we'll do the rest. But just one more. Um, can a client who's residing in public housing receive assistance? So if a person lives in public housing, can we not assist them with the client's portion?
You cannot. So you can, if they get into a situation where they have arrears, then you could with prevention funds assist with arrears if they're at that imminent risk of homelessness stage. But you cannot pay the ongoing rent. You cannot pay the client's portion of the ongoing rental assistance.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I see the rest of the questions in chat. Again, we will do those after Chris's piece because his may address some of these. So with that, I'll give it to Chris.
Sure, thank you. And with this piece, it'll just sort of add on to Lisa's eligible expenses and activities. This is what the documentation is really just as important as you understanding what's eligible and what's allowable. Now what we'll go over is the documentation you must have in your client files so that no one will fall at risk of potentially having to pay back funds based on not having the proper documentation. So if you have questions, again, please feel free to chat them in or we'll answer them at the end. But we can go ahead and get started. With this, the documentation piece of our information here, all of our files that you'll see that require documentation, the client file forms that's required for ESG CV funding, which are the same as those that are required for our regular ESG, can be found on our website. So you can always go to our link, go to our website and pull up all the client files that are required for housing stability activities, both rapid rehousing and prevention. Next slide. One of the things that we have on our website is our client file form matrix. Very small here, so it's not, you guys won't be able to see all the detail on it, but what we did was we put together a matrix which identifies all the files that are needed for a particular ESG funded program. And on the matrix here that you'll see, it includes additional ESG funded programs, which would be emergency shelter services, so on and so forth. What is of interest to you all in this particular webinar would be those categories identified as rapid rehousing, financial assistance, prevention services, and prevention financial assistance. If you ever have questions as to what files are needed to be in your client file folder for that particular client and program activity, you would just pull up the matrix and follow the X to the corresponding forms. The forms you see are labeled from 1.1 through to 6.0, which is the client exit form. So you would then just track the actual form that, again, corresponds to your program and activity, which would be most likely rapid rehousing and some prevention. We have mostly rapid rehousing agencies and some with prevention. So that's how we've made that a little bit tried to make it easier so you guys can sort of track your forms as you move forward. Next slide. Client file checklist. We have that's going to be our first form, which is form number 1.3 for rapid rehousing client files. As we did with the matrix, we actually created a checklist so that you would have the checklist in that client file and check off all the client forms that are included in your file folder, and also any additional forms that may not be actually ones that we require, but we recommend that you keep in your client file. So what you see here are just two examples of our client file checklist. Forms 1.3 is for rapid rehousing, and form 1.4 is for prevention, for homeless prevention activities. I would like to bring your attention to the top right-hand corner of the client file checklist. HMIS client identifying number must be included on each of these checklists, and also within each and every file. You want to make certain that you include the entry date, the client move-in date, if the client has moved in, when that client file is asked to be reviewed, and definitely the client exit date. You want to make sure you include all the information that's required on your client file checklist so that it makes it easier for us as we work through monitoring and looking at your client files. Again, this is just an abbreviated portion of it. It's a bit longer. We ask that you go to our website, take a look at these forms for those that are not currently funded ESG rapid rehousing programs, that are not familiar with it. Please familiarize yourselves with those forms, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call. Client file, housing stabilization, rapid rehousing. These are our client files for rapid rehousing and prevention programs. These are the forms that are required to be in your client file folders. Again, the checklist that I just showed you guys, client file 1.3, 1.4, these are the checklists. Checklists are actually a required form because we have no idea what's included in your file, what forms you have, what forms you don't have. So you want to make sure that your client file checklists are included in every client file and indeed checked off accordingly based on what you have in your client file folder. Forms again are numbered. 3.2 form would be your intake forms. 3.5 would be the third-party verification of client's income. Just sort of a hint for 3.5, pretty much will not be required for rapid rehousing. Upon entry, you would not fill that actual form out until after 12 months within the program. If we are monitoring a prevention client file, we expect that file to be in your client file folder because that is the verification of client's income is required for prevention programs. Income calculation worksheet. These are, again, just forms that we ask you to utilize to help you all with working with your client. What I have seen over the past is even with housing, rapid rehousing agencies, yes, income's not a requirement for eligibility and to be a part of their entry into the program, but a lot of our agencies utilize that in their case management process just for budgeting and just to help work with the client as they sort of work to move towards self-sufficiency. Form 3.8, which is our housing barrier matrix, that form is utilized to show us that you've actually identified the barriers. There's different levels to barriers of housing, and what your initial housing stabilization plan would be for that particular client. Form 3.8A would be your stabilization action plan, your monthly update. Part of ESG rapid rehousing housing stability funding is that you meet with each client once a month to make sure that you're tracking progress and just to make sure that you're working with them. Again, our ultimate goal is to achieve self-sufficiency. We have that form in our client file so that you can update that on a monthly basis to show us that you are indeed providing that assistance to your client, even if it's just to state that I met with Chris Battle. He's still on path. He still has his job and working to achieve self-sufficiency, signed by both you and the client, or by you if it was done by phone. But that form is there to just let us know what you guys are doing, especially if you're receiving rapid rehousing or prevention services. As Lisa mentioned, that typically would be your case management, and the only way for us to verify that those actions are still happening within the agency is to look at the monthly update form. Form 3.9 would be a financial assistance tracking form. That would be simply to track all of the financial assistance provided to all of your clients, whether it's rental assistance, security deposits for rent, utility deposit assistance, things of that nature. We just need for you to complete that particular form and use that for your tracking of all the financial assistance. Lisa mentioned a rental assistance agreement. These are all forms that are required to be there. So keep in mind, if any one of these forms that are required are not in your client file, that client file then becomes ineligible. That client becomes ineligible. If the client's ineligible, all the funds that you've expended on that particular client then are ineligible funds that you may have submitted reimbursement for to us, which it potentially could be an issue, could be an actual payback situation. So we want to make sure that all required forms are always included, signed, dated, and completely filled out. Your rent reasonableness form, Form 4.1, your VAWA forms, which are your victims against women's domestic violence situations, Violence Against Women Act. You want to make sure that those are in your client file as well. And your habitability standards checklist, which I think in lieu of that, back at home right now, are working with HQS. We have HQS inspections that's going to be available and provided for all back at home agencies. So that should make it a little bit easier for you all. However, the habitability standards is a required form. So what we would know that your HQS inspection has been put there in place of that. And again, your client exit form. And I apologize for going down each and every form. I wanted to, this particular webinar, we did not provide the forms for you all to look at. So that's why I spent a bit more detail on each and every form as we move forward in this presentation. But as we move forward also in back at home and ESG funding, we urge you to contact our office if you have any questions regarding any of the forms I just mentioned here. Next slide. Wow, that was a lot. I spent a ton of time on that slide. I'm sorry, guys. Client files, again, rapid rehousing and prevention. I told you that there were forms that were required. Those were the forms that we just mentioned. These are what we recommend. We recommend that you keep in your client file your coordinated entry documentation, your case notes, all the services provided, your referrals, correspondence, HMIS and data sharing plan, information like that. Again, our goal is to just ensure that we provide the best services across the state of North Carolina to get folks rapidly rehoused, keep folks in housing, but we want to make sure we do it in compliance with all the regulations of HUD and the state of North Carolina. The best way for us to do that is to by way of your client files. And with your client files tell the story as to how that person entered into your program, what was done while they were in your program, and how they exited your program. These recommended files of information that we have here helps tell that story. So if we call for HMIS number file 4621, it helps tell the story as to what your agency provided for that particular client. Next slide. Some best practices for client files. We've noticed that all client files must have an HMIS or DV comparable database number. Again, our job is again to administer the program and to monitor to make sure that that you are in compliance and the expenses are eligible and allowable. When we look at a client file, there are multiple pieces of paper and form within the client file. Of the required forms that I listed, a great majority of them require HMIS numbers. You want to make sure the HMIS number is included on each of the files that require an HMIS number, as well as the additional information in the client file. Have HMIS numbers on those. Those are best practices. It allows us to be able to keep track of that information as we look through those client files. All client files are required to be kept, as you all know, confidential and safe in secure locations. You want to make sure that you adhere to that particular guideline, and it is a best practice. You want to make sure that client files that need to be separated by activity. This is important, especially for you back at home agencies that provide both rapid rehousing and homeless prevention. Those are two identified separate activities under ESG and HUD. So those two clients, you want to make sure. What could potentially happen is you could have a client that's receiving rapid rehousing. You guys have assisted them for 3 months, let's say. They've exited the program, and then they contact your office, or the referral comes back across your desk to say, hey, this client needs help, they're about to be evicted. And then prevention will kick in to assist them because you have prevention funding available. What we don't want you to do is to reopen the rapid rehousing client file, the physical file, because you're going to have within HMIS, you're definitely going to have a different number, because they're not a different HMIS number, but a different activity, because they're identified differently. But we want to make sure that the client file is actually a different client file and separate from the rapid rehousing client file. So if we come in to monitor, and Chris Battle was in your program and received services from rapid rehousing as well as prevention, and I asked you for Chris Battle's file for both programs, please don't hand us one client file. Those client files should be separate and unique. They should have two separate client files. HMIS number will be the same, however, but everything else should be different. So make sure that you separate those programs for those that have more than one activity. Other best practices each file must contain appropriate ESG checklists and divided out accordingly. However you guys would like to capture that information, we want it to follow the checklist, whether it's under tab 1 or however the tabs are. When we monitor and look at a client file, just make sure that the checklist and the information provided below the checklist, within the checklist, are in that order inside your client file when submitted to us. Again, primarily this year, I would think up until at least the end of this year, requesting client files and doing monitoring will probably be virtual. You guys will probably be desk monitoring, so not virtual, but more desk monitoring. You guys will be sending that information into us. So just pay close attention to your client file checklist. And as you prepare that on a daily basis, working with your client, that you're just able to check each and every one of those boxes off and sort of build your file like that, so that when we request it, you guys are submitted as you have already prepared it. Any deviations from any of these forms that we've mentioned here today must be approved by our office. We understand that a lot of your agencies already have existing programs similar to maybe rapid rehousing or prevention, and captures 99.9% of the same information. And you really don't want to upset the apple cart by creating new forms to fit with ESG. We understand that and will approve forms to be used that you already have in place, but they must be submitted to our office for approval first. So just keep that in mind, and we're more than willing to work with you all. Next slide. Common file issues sort of go back to the best practices. You just want to make sure that forms that require signatures and dates and HMIS numbers actually have them on there. Small things like signatures and dates can mean a big difference when it comes to eligible and not eligible. Good example, if you have a verification of homelessness form for a client, the client is supposed to sign it. The client didn't sign it, and you can't get in contact with that client again. Clients moved to Mexico or moved to California or something. Well, at that point, let's say if you spent $3,000 on that client, you can't get a signature for that client. Technically, we would have to deem that client as ineligible, and all the funds spent on that particular client would be ineligible expenses and would have to be paid back to the state. So you want to make sure that you pay close attention to your signatures, make sure they're dated, and make sure all the information on those forms are complete. Some more issues we sort of talked about: files being out of order. Again, follow the checklist, can't go wrong. Just look at the checklist, keep the files in those in that order, and you'll that won't be an issue for you all. Your multiple activities, we talked about that. Keep those separate if you have both prevention and rapid rehousing. The third-party backup documentation not in the file, huge issue. We've seen that not quite regularly, but we wanted to make sure that we mentioned that as an issue, because if the third-party verification information is not in the client file for rapid rehousing and prevention, again, that holds that particular client ineligible, because that is what we are utilizing to verify literally homelessness or at risk of homelessness for prevention. So you want to make sure that that third-party backup documentation is definitely in your client files. And client files not being created at entry. We've had issues where folks get bombarded or sort of just work in the habit of working with clients and sort of go back and create the client file a day or two after entry. We've even seen folks create the file, a few weeks after entry. That could potentially cause huge issues where we're talking about signatures not being there, dates are incorrect. It can really lead to some significant compliance issues as far as not having that proper documentation in place. So we highly recommend that you create files upon entry, work with those files throughout the process of that, working with that client, exit them out, and close that file out. Please don't create a client file after entry. It's really hard to document that properly once you start working with the high caseload. Next slide. And that is all that we have for you all today. We're available for questions right now. I think we have plenty of time left, both Lisa and I. I know I went through it pretty quickly. So Sarah, we turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. I think that is one of the most engaging presentations I've seen that's all about like minutia and documentation. So thank you very much for that.
Quite welcome.
And Lisa has really been such a trooper in this chat. I think she has answered everybody's questions that have come in so far as I can see. But as Chris said, we do have plenty of time, so if folks want to add more questions into the chat, or you are actually welcome to unmute yourself and speak your question out loud too.
So I see Ricky's question about, if case conferencing is occurring via FaceTime or Zoom, how should the client signature be obtained? So we've been recommending that agencies, just note that, that you're not meeting in person with the client for case management services, at the moment due to COVID. Please, if you put the word COVID on there, it should cover you. So just note that on whatever form it may be, the 3.8A or any other form that you might need to get signed along the way. And then, make every effort to go back and get that client signature, when this is all over, whenever that might be. But if I think HUD understands, given that they've waived the in-person case management requirement right now. I think they understand that signatures are going to be missing or hard to obtain through a computer screen. So I think there's some allowance for that at the moment.
And to piggyback on what Lisa said, I think what's important is not to leave segments blank for us to assume that, oh, maybe they just couldn't get the client signature, or maybe they did this A, B, or C. So please identify what method you've taken. You've spoken to the client by phone, client agreed, and it was witnessed by staff person X. We just ask that you have that there so that as we move forward, if the time ever comes where, again, that client has totally left, the country, that would, I believe, will be suffice for us to provide to HUD, as you guys haven't done your due diligence to get that information, even though we would like for you to, maybe at some point get those signatures. If that is not able to happen, to have that extra information and those extra sort of descriptions in those forms would work. And I think Lisa and I would be a whole lot more comfortable sitting in front of HUD to answer that question with that explanation there as to a blank.
Yes, yes, blanks are no good. Explanations, good. I see somebody had asked about electronic signatures. Yes, we are accepting electronic signatures until further notice at this point for just about everything. So yes, electronic signatures are good. So I'm reading through this question in the chat from Kathy about distinguishing between ESG CV client and a regular ESG client. You are exactly correct, and HUD has actually made that statement that essentially if you are homeless during this time, then it is COVID related. So, you know, anybody experiencing homelessness can be a CV client. They qualify for CV as well as, you know, the regular annual ESG. It might be, you know, more of a prioritization thing for, you know, which funds you decide to use. I know back at home, they're going to have, you know, presentation, I believe tomorrow or at least later this week about prioritization and, you know, the surge populations and that sort of thing. So, you know, definitely if, you know, if somebody's in that prioritization or surge population, then I would, you know, go towards the ESG CD fund. But essentially, yes, everybody is eligible for both. There's not much distinction at this point as far as HUD's concerned. Thank you, Ashley. Prioritization training tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Love it. Love the way we're plugging all the trainings to come.
Hey, I'm trying to get better at the marketing thing. I am. I'm working on it. Okay, hang on. There was a requisition question. Is the requisition process the same with timelines for regular ESG ROH? In general, yes, the requisition process is going to be the same. If you're talking about timelines as far as like the 45 days to submit your requisition after the end of the month, we do expect that to be the same. The turnaround as far as payments once your requisition has been submitted should be, you know, where it is now or better. So yes, we're expecting those sorts of things to be the same for ESG CV as it is with regular ESG. Are forms fillable? No, unfortunately, they're not. Sorry.
However, if you're able to change those forms to a fillable form that looks exactly like ours, and you're willing to send that in for our approval, we'll be more than happy to take a look at it and possibly approve it. I feel like we would.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to make the forms fillable and then submit them to us, that'd be great. Yeah. So just a little bit, since somebody asked about requisitions. So for those of you who are current ESG recipients, you already know this, but and you know probably most of what was in this presentation, but we do have some new agencies to back at home that haven't been previously funded with ESG. So we do ask that you submit some of this documentation with your requisition. So we will be checking for things like the verification of homelessness, the lease, those sorts of key pieces will need to be submitted with your requisition, just so we can do a very basic verification that your client and your unit are eligible when we are reviewing the requisition to ensure that the funds are going to eligible clients and units. So again, there will be much more detail on that later, but just a heads up that we do ask for some of this in the requisition.
Hi, this is Natasha from Central Piedmont. I have a question. is the housing finance, the requisition site available already, or is that something we'll get the link to later on, or?
It is not currently available, and so things are just sort of in process at the moment. So yes, you will get much more information and on how that whole process is going to go, hopefully very shortly, but it is not currently available.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Question about repair costs, purchase of appliances, things like that. Unfortunately, no, ESG doesn't cover those things, even though some of them are required to pass inspection. So we are looking at, there's conversation daily, I think, about, potential other funding sources to do some of those types of things. So, stay tuned. There may be some other funding sources available down the road, but currently those are not allowable through ESG. So the 2 intake forms on the website, as many of you know, there's 2 HMIS implementations in the state, NC HMIS and HMIS at NCCEH. So it depends on which HMIS implementation your agency is with or your COC is with, as to which intake form and exit form that you would use. So if you have questions about if you don't know which HMIS implementation you're with, then just shoot us a question and we can let you know. But yeah, that's why there's different intake and exit forms. It's for the different HMIS implementations. So you only need to use one, but pick the right one for your HMIS system.
I see there's a question about minimum time period for a lease. For ESG, we do require 1-year lease.
No, Chris, sorry. Remember we reviewed that. We didn't find, we only found that for project-based rental assistance.
That's correct. That is you're right.
Sorry. I had told somebody no earlier, so I didn't want them to get confused. But yeah, so there has been a lot of questions in the chat about the time period for the lease. So if the unit that the client is going into is a project-based rental assistance unit, meaning there is rental assistance tied to that unit, then it does have to be a 12-month lease. However, for everything else, if it is not a project-based rental assistance unit, then it does not have to be a 12-month lease. So the answer is yes and no.
The important piece there is that the rental assistance agreement is completed, which is required, but that's a federal regulation.
Yeah, you must have the rental assistance agreement, and the lease, even if it's not for 12 months, it must state the time period that it is for. It must state the security deposit amount, the rental assistance amount, the address of the unit. All of those key pieces must still be there in order to be a valid lease, and it must be signed by both parties and all of that. So well, it doesn't have to be for 12 months. It does have to meet some other specifications to ensure that, both parties are covered and know what they're agreeing to. So will an inspection be required if it is just for utility assistance or deposit? So if they are moving into if it's a rapid rehousing client and they're moving into a new unit and the only thing that you're paying is the utility assistance or deposit, yes, you do still have to do the inspection.
Thank you so much for all of these excellent questions, everyone. I will do what they taught me in social work school and let there be like another, few uncomfortable seconds of silence to make sure that we do give room for anyone else who wants to ask questions. Again, you're welcome to put it in the chat or to unmute yourself and say your question out loud.
So Ricky, yes, there's going to be, or might be already in place, I'm not sure exactly the status, but there will be a contracted agency that does all of the inspections through Back at Home. So your staff won't have to do those inspections. They'll be done through the contracted agency.
Let's see a question from Kathy Bragg about project-based. Project-based would be if you all, for example, identified apartment complex with 6 units there, and you guys were holding the master lease for those and were able to have clients have those be accessible to them for rapid rehousing, then the 12-month lease is required. Great majority, I don't think we have any agencies that actually have project-based rental assistance right now.
The required documents are not available in Spanish. I would love that, and it's definitely something we should be working on, but currently they are not available in Spanish. Hang on. Well, just scrolling through, make sure I don't miss anything. So habitability, there's a question about if habitability will be an option and not using the contracted provider. I think there's going to be some more information on that in one of the presentations later this week. Can't remember the title of that one. I don't do marketing, well, I'm not good at it. But I believe that would still be an option, but there's, and that your staff could still do those inspections. But there will definitely be more information on how all that will work in additional trainings throughout this week.
You know, I'm realizing I'm really slow to the draw. I'm answering questions that Lisa's already typed 100 miles an hour in answers to. I apologize for that.
That's okay. It's just because you're not in the next office and you can't hear me loudly banging away on my keyboard.
Exactly.
Do we need to keep an ineligible client file? Yes, we would. It's very minimal information, as I'm sure you know, Ricky, but yes, we do have an ineligible client file checklist, and then a couple of documents to include in that file just to document that. So yes, you would still have that file.
Excellent. And I answered a question in chat, but just for folks who haven't looked at chat, someone asked if there would be a link available to download slides, and I shared that yes, the North Carolina Coalition on Homelessness, we're building a page on our website to hold all of the recordings and copies of the slides so that you can refer to them and also share them with other folks that you work with who weren't able to attend. Well, folks, I think the questions are slowing down. I want to just say thank you so much to Chris and Lisa, who were willing to really be grilled today, just rapid fire, really excellent, really nuanced questions, and I appreciate it so much. I know, I think I speak for lots of folks on the call that it's so nice to be able to have your ear and hear your expertise. And thank you to everyone for participating. Please stay tuned for our other trainings. We hope to see you throughout the rest of the week.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.